The next chapter is The Pageant. Oh, what we've all been waiting for. Oh, I can see we're going to have some dubbing issues here. Who cares? Midsummer Day dawned long before most of the performers destined to take their share in Mr. Gear's religious circus had awakened from sleep. Mary Crow, however, who was to take no part in it save as a spectator, was awake soon after the first glimmer of dawn. To watch the processes of dawn from a window that faces west is in a sense like the contemplation of various excited expressions crossing a human countenance when the cause of such feelings is absent. The girl propped herself up in bed, reached for her drawing gown, which was at her bed's foot, wound it like a shawl around her neck, and watched the slow, stealthy expanding of the gray light. She remembered having heard John once defend the biblical account of the creation when Tom Barter criticized it as separating the creation of the sun from the creation of light. John had maintained that light was an entity quite independent of its immediate origin. Certainly did look to Mary now as if light were an entity free of all connection with the sun. She could see the great ruined tower arch of the Abbey Church as she lay there, and she could see the tops of the elm trees beyond it, very ghostly and phantom-like, their greenness only half-born. The arch, it seemed, assimilated itself to this dawn light far less easily than the treetops. It isolated itself in some ways from the process of dawn and emphasized its own curves and moldings and masonry, in resistance, as it were, to these atmospheric effects. But the foliage of the treetops was part of it. The foliage of the treetops, as Mary watched it now, seemed to contain within itself the infinite sadness of this gray, half-born Cimmerian light that was now slowly invading the world and establishing itself in the cold aisles and in the blank corridors of darkness. Filmy wisps of gray mist hung about these treetops, mist that was liker to dewdrops than raindrops, and yet did not really suggest water drops at all. Nor did it suggest clouds. They were things by themselves, sui generis, those dawn mists, and they seemed to have sus generis? I don't know how to pronounce it. And they seemed to have as remote a connection with water in any localized form as the dim light in which they dropped and waved and rose and sank had with the invisible sun. Yes, thought Mary, something in the foliage of those trees flows forth to greet the sad light, and this does not seem like sunlight, just as something in me flows out to greet it. Okay. Will it be fine today? That was the next thought that Mary had. She had been to the North Lode Street room for a few minutes yesterday evening, and had found John and Tom together. They were drinking whiskey, and the former was in a state of complete exhaustion. John had told her that the mayor was resolved to carry this affair through, wet or fine, but that he had somehow convinced himself. You know the way he talks to his God as if he were standing by his side? That it would not be allowed to rain on the day of Glastonbury resurgence. Mary felt full of doubt and anxiety. All manner of troubling thoughts assailed her. Suppose the whole thing was a monstrous failure. Suppose the performers got panic-stricken and that French clown lost his head in some wild antic of improvisation quite out of keeping with the rest. She had seen a fragment of the Passion Play rehearsed, and she felt totally unable to conceive how Mr. Evans could even carry his part off, far less be successful in it. Rumors had been running wildly through the town for the last week about the police from Taunton interfering and arresting the principal players. And the last thing Mary had heard before she went to bed last night was news brought into the kitchen by Weatherwax that the expected strike in the dye works had come and that the Glastonbury factory had locked out all its hands that morning. So far, the gardener's story said, let me start that again. So far, the gardener's story said, the trouble had not extended to the crow's plant at Wookiee, but that also, so Weatherwax declared, might have a lookout tomorrow. Even the Wookiee hands had demanded, and apparently had been given, a holiday today, so that as Mary lay propped up on her pillows, waiting for the first yellow beams to strike the great broken arch in front of her, she seemed to catch trouble in the air, coming from every side. Barter had told her that this town was already filled to overflowing with visitors. Parties of German, Dutchmen, Scandinavians, even a few French people, had filled the streets yesterday. She herself had been startled by the crowds as she went to North Lode Street. Mary was of a realistic and practical turn of mind, but her nerves felt thoroughly shaky now. In this cold dawn air, alone with rooks, elm trees, tops, ruins, and wood pigeons, 1,000 alarms and terrors visited her. She imagined all those factory hands, the strikers from the Glastonbury Works, the holiday makers from Wookiee, joining in a great mob and invading the field. She imagined a wild tumult taking place in the midst of the performance, wherein John would be arrested by the police, handcuffed and carried off in a motor car to Tawdon. The pageant itself, she had learned, was not so to begin till 2 in the afternoon. But since a portion of the field had been handed over to the ordinary booth holders, toy and sweet vendors, trinket sellers, fruit and nut dealers, and so forth, whirligigs and roundabouts alone being excluded, and since gypsy caravans, too, were to be allowed in by the mayor's special indulgence, there would be festivities going on in Torfields long before that hour and plenty of opportunities for such a mixed public to work themselves up into a riotous state of mind before the official program began. Now, where did that sentence begin? That was a long sentence. It was with a shock of real amazement, as something that seemed more blood-red than sunlight hit the left-hand column of the great broken arch, that the girl lifted her head now. She let her twisted dressing gown fall loose from her shoulders, and propped herself still higher in the bed, with the palms of her hands pressed against the mattress. For she became aware that the sight of this unnatural light, in reality it was a wine-colored red, touched from a quite indescribable nuance of purple, was giving her a spasm of irrational happiness. She leaned forward, allowing her dislodged dressing gown to slide down upon the pillows behind her, and quite disregarded the fact that a cool sunrise wind was blowing against her flimsy-clad figure. Her soul had come back with a violent spasm like a rush of blood to their head, and her whole nature seemed to pour itself out towards the reddish light of that tall column. Her pulse of happiness was intense. What she experienced was like a quivering, low love ecstasy that had no human object. She could actually feel the small round breasts under her nightgown shiver and distend. Her head instinctively fell back a little, while her chin was lifted up. Her lips parted, and a smile that was a smile of indescribable peace flicked over her face. She would have served at that moment as a model for some primitive Flemish artist painting a passionately concentrated vision of the rape of Danae. Whatever it was that stirred her so, the effect of it soon passed. But Mary told no one, not even John, of the experience she had had on the dawn of the Baptist Day. The invisible watchers, however, of human life in Glastonbury noted well this event. She has been allowed to see it, they said to one another. Will she be the one, the only one among all these people? When 2 o'clock struck in the belfries and towers of the town, there was an expectant stir amid the great company of spectators in the wide sloping fields at the foot of the tor. A surprising number of seats and wooden benches had been procured for the mayor's great occasion, and upon these seats sat a vast crowd of people, all of them roused at this moment to a pitch of excitement such as had not been experienced in that place since the days when the last abbot of Glastonbury had met his doom. Like the famous Homeric wind sweeping over a cornfield, this cumulative wave of crowd hypnosis shivered through these assembled people, straightening their shoulders, lifting their heads, turning their faces towards the grassy turrets of the slope above them. Had Philip Crow's airplane been flying low down then, over this tightly packed crowd who had seats to sit upon, and over the equally large crowd at the back of them, and at their flanks who had no seats except the grass, it would have been of fascinated interest to note the varieties of human types gathered so close together. Many of these, without seats, lay sideways on the sward, or so crouched and hugging their knees, or sat crouched hugging their knees, while behind them all, drifting about or standing still, as their vagrant mood dictated, were large stray groups of what might be termed casual transients. Gypsies from the caravans ranged in rows among the hedge, nut vendors, peddlers with their trays, hawkers with packs strapped to their backs, beggars, tramps, groups of astonished and cautious shepherds from the high mendips, stray factory hands from Wookey and Street and the City of Wells. All these, mingled with a number of stricken strikers from the dye works of that town itself, kept circulating and surging, advancing and retreating, jostling, edging, dodging, hovering, spying, mocking, criticizing, deriding, applauding, just as the wind of accident and the beckoning of caprice carried them there or here. The 2 front rows of seats had been reserved for local magnates, and in spite of all the suspicion, jealousy, distrust that was about, these seats had very few empty spaces. Miss Elizabeth Crow was there with Lady Rachel. Mrs. Philip Crow ought to have been there, for although Philip had taken the opportunity of flying to Wookey Hole, his wife, under the influence of Emma, who was here with Louis and Lily, had decided not to miss what she now spoke of as something to rest a person's mind. But Tilly's dislike of publicity was so great that she had refused this place of honor and had to be ensconced in the 4th row. On the other side of Lady Rachel, however, there was an empty chair, for the girl had done all she could to persuade her father to come, and there was still a good chance that he might. Ned Atling, who had written a considerable portion of the words of the whole performance, was one of the principal play actors. Miss Bibby Fell, who was duly seated by Dr. Fell's side, and next to her were Lawyer Beard and Angela, and behind them Miss Drew and Mary. By Mary's side, John had found a place for a foreign priest. In the central portion of the 2nd row of seats, behind these personages, were the vicar and his son, for though Sam had steadily refused to have anything to do with the performances and was now reduced to agitated burnings of heart by the presence of Nell, he had been unwilling to refuse his father when Matt had made an especial appeal to him not to desert him on this occasion. Next to Matt and Sam sat Mr. Wallop, and in company with Mr. Wallop, almost the whole staff of Wallop's shop. Being a bachelor, and also having an equal and unfailing interest in all mundane spectacles, Mr. Wallop had felt it incumbent upon him to be found on this occasion holding up, as he called it, his proper end. Well, we'll continue with the Glastonbury pageants next day. Until then, I'll see you in Glastonbury. Cheers.